Hi, I'm Dr. John Oyston. I'm recording this presentation in March 2021 as the world begins a global rollout of vaccines against COVID. In this presentation, I'm going to make some comparisons between tobacco and COVID. In particular, I'm going to look at the idea that vaping could be equivalent to a vaccine in our war against tobacco. So first of all, I'm going to talk about what the concept of vaccination is. Then I'm going to talk about why tobacco is worse than COVID. I'm going to talk about vaping as a less harmful alternative to cigarette smoking. I'm going to raise the idea that teenagers who start vaping are vaccinated against cigarette smoking, and that smokers can use vaping as a way to quit smoking. I'm then going to point out that the medical establishment has been opposed to vaping, and they see it as a challenge to the medical model of smoking cessation. They're almost acting like anti-vaxxers on this issue, which is very unfortunate because I don't know how we get to an end game for tobacco without involving vaping. So first of all, the concept of vaccination. The idea of a vaccination is that you deliberately expose people to something which is slightly harmful in order to protect them against a deadly disease. It began in 1796 when Jenner deliberately injected a child with cowpox, which caused a mild disease, and this made the child immune to smallpox, which was a deadly plague. So he called it vaccination, using the Latin word vacca, meaning cow. Early vaccines often depended on using a deliberately weakened form of a disease-causing organism, and this is how the vaccines for stuff like tuberculosis and polio were developed. They gave people enough exposure to the disease-causing organism that they developed immunity without actually developing the full-blown disease. Vaccination has been incredibly successful, and now diseases like polio and measles only exist in communities that have deliberately chosen not to use vaccination. Smallpox itself was completely wiped out by global vaccination campaigns. So tobacco is worse than COVID in several ways. First of all, it just kills more people. It's now been a year since the WHO declared a global pandemic of COVID. And in that time, COVID has killed less than half as many people as tobacco kills in an average year. The figure is the same, the proportion is the same, whether you look at the Canadian figures or at the global figures. Secondly, COVID kills people older and tobacco kills people when they're younger. About half of all COVID deaths are in people over 85, whereas half of tobacco deaths are in people under 70. Also, if you die from COVID, you probably only suffer for about 5 weeks. That's the typical time between onset of symptoms and death for the people who do die of COVID. But tobacco smoke can kill you very, very slowly, and you can suffer for a very long time. You can live for decades as a cardiac cripple, as someone dependent on oxygen, as somebody in a wheelchair due to an amputation or a stroke, and you may have to undergo cancer surgery or cancer chemotherapy. On a philosophical basis, tobacco is also worse than COVID. The tobacco industry deliberately exists and has been around for about 100 years and has been deliberately killing people for that time. It makes a few people rich at the expense of killing half of its customers. It continues to be profitable and to expand into new products and new countries. Even though tobacco was shown to be lethal 60 years ago, it's still sold in convenience stores around the world, and it contributes to 15% of all the world's deaths. COVID, by comparison, is a chance mutation of an existing coronavirus. It didn't exist before 2019, and hopefully within a few years, it will be controllable and no worse than the seasonal flu. I spent 40 years in the operating room working as an anesthesiologist. I spent this time with surgical colleagues who were trying to repair the hearts of people whose hearts had been damaged by cigarette smoke, who were removing lung cancers and other cancers from smokers, and in some cases were having to amputate the limbs of smokers because they could no longer be salvaged. As a result of this experience, I find it hard to believe that the tobacco industry is still allowed to exist. If you kill one person, it's murder. If you kill 20,000 people, it's just another day at work for the global tobacco industry. Now, one of the problems with trying to get rid of tobacco is that some people are addicted to nicotine, and they need an alternative, safer source. And this is where vaping can come in. So vaping is less harmful than smoking. That's a direct quote from the Health Canada website. Health Canada also says that vaping products do not produce smoke, contain tobacco, or involve burning. In the United States, they call vaping a tobacco product, and that's just a lie. There is no tobacco in vape. In England, Public Health England says that e-cigarettes are not harmless, but they are 95% less harmful than cigarette smoking. In the United States, the National Academy of Science, Engineering and Medicine says there is conclusive evidence that completely substituting e-cigarettes for combustible tobacco cigarettes reduces exposure to numerous toxicants and carcinogens present in combustible tobacco cigarettes. And in the fall of 2020, WHO Europe came to the same conclusion and used almost an identical set of words. Now, some people don't believe governments, they don't trust the WHO, they don't trust public health. And for those people, there's YouTube, and in particular this gentleman, Chris Notap. So he's someone you might call a citizen scientist. So one day in his backyard, he set up this apparatus. He created 2 artificial lungs using bell jars and cotton wool balls, and he connected both of them to pumps so that the one on the left could smoke cigarettes and the one on the right could vape. The smoking bell jar he subjected to a pack a day for a month, and he gave the other bell jar an equivalent amount of vape. At the end of the month, it's almost impossible to see inside the smoking bell jar. There's so much tar on the walls of the bell jar and on the lungs inside, and the tubing inside was almost completely occluded. If you look at the right-hand side, the vaping lung jar is not pristine, it's a little bit cloudy. There's a little bit clear fluid on the lungs inside. But it's not scientific, but I would say that it's 95% healthier than the smoking lung jar. My next point is that teens who vape are unlikely to smoke because vaping is better than smoking. Vaping is safer and cheaper. It's fast and convenient. It's much easier to quickly pick up a vape and take a couple of puffs than to open a packet of cigarettes, to find a cigarette, an ashtray, some matches. Once you've started to smoke a cigarette, you commit it to about 5 minutes because it's hard to get rid of a cigarette once it's half burnt. With vape, there's no risk of fire, there's no risk of burning anything. Vapes are robust and they're waterproof. They're easy to hide. In high school, girls put them in a bra, the boys put them in their pencil case, they look like a USB key or a marker. Vapes produce a small amount of vape, compared to cigarettes, which produce significant amounts of strongly smelling smoke. If somebody in a room is smoking, everybody in the room knows it. But the smell of vape is so mild you could convince somebody that maybe it was an aftershave, a perfume or shampoo. Vapes come in many flavors, whereas smoking only comes in tobacco flavor. And finally, vaping is modern, whereas smoking is old-fashioned. So think about it. If you had a digital camera, would you still take your photos to the lab to be processed? If you had Instagram and email, would you mail postcards from your vacation? If you had Netflix, Amazon Prime and HBO, would you still drive to Blockbuster and rent a video? If you had a vape, would you buy a packet of cigarettes? Well, is this just me thinking about things, or is there some actual evidence that this is happening and that young people are switching to vaping and using vaping rather than cigarette smoking? Well, this graph looks at smoking amongst boys in high school in the United States. And as you can see, between 1990 and about 2010, there was a slow decline in cigarette smoking in all grades. So e-cigarettes became available in the United States in 2007, and they became common about 2010. And even more common in 2015 when Juul entered the market. And as you can see, the rate of decline in cigarette smoking has become faster as more people have started vaping. This bar graph looks at people who regularly vape or smoke. That's 20 days or more each month. And if you look at the vaping figures on the left in Canada, you can see that between 2017 and 2019, it's true that the amount of vaping has gone up. But the amount of cigarette smoking, the thing that actually kills you, has declined. And the same is true in the States. There's more vaping, but there's less cigarette smoking. So you would think that people like the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids would be really happy and would be publicizing the fact that teenage smoking is down to historically low levels. But in fact, they're not. They're complaining that e-cigarettes are threatening decades of progress in reducing youth tobacco use. That's exactly not true. E-cigarettes are accelerating the decline in youth smoking. E-cigarettes can help people stop smoking. If you look on the internet, you'll find that there are thousands of people who claim that e-cigarettes and vaping have saved their lives by being able to get them to quit smoking when all else had failed. Some of them say they quit smoking by accident. They bought a vape just to experiment out of curiosity, and then they found a week had gone by and they hadn't smoked a single cigarette. Others say that when they switched from smoking to vaping, they thought there would be a hard point when they would start to miss cigarettes, but they never did. They found that vaping was an acceptable alternative. However, some people want more scientific information and dismiss these anecdotes. So the New England Journal of Medicine has published a randomized controlled trial by Peter Hayek, in which he was able to prove that e-cigarettes are more effective at getting smokers to quit than conventional nicotine replacement therapy. There have been several other similar studies, and these have been assessed by the Cochrane collaboration, which has concluded that yes, e-cigarettes have been scientifically proven to help smokers quit. In the United Kingdom, Public Health England has endorsed vaping as a way to quit smoking, and as a result, National Health Service hospitals now sometimes actually include vape shops. Also, if you go onto British Main Street and go into one of the pharmacies, you'll find that there's the vitamin aisle, the eye care aisle, and there's the smoking alternatives aisle. And in the smoking alternatives aisle, there's Juul and other e-cigarettes on the top shelf at eye level, and below that, there's the other forms of nicotine replacement therapy. Public Health England thinks that this has been so successful that it contributes to 50 to 70,000 extra people who quit smoking every year. So in the UK now, there are about 3.6 million vapers, and almost half of those are people who have stopped smoking entirely by switching to vaping. One interesting side effect of this is attendance at the National Health Service stop smoking clinics is down. People don't need to go to stop smoking clinics anymore to learn how to quit smoking. It's estimated that in America we could save 6.6 million lives if we could get smokers to switch to vaping. You would think that physicians, public health, and government health agencies would be really happy that we have a new method to get people to stop smoking, but that's not the truth. In fact, vaping is actually seen as a threat to the medical model of smoking cessation. Smokers no longer need physicians, pharmacists, or other healthcare workers to quit smoking. They no longer need expensive nicotine replacement therapy or prescription drugs. So this democratization and disintermediation of smoking cessation is actually seen as a threat to many established medical groups and businesses. For example, in the UK, the sale of prescription medications for smoking cessation has dropped 70% since vaping became available. However, big business is fighting back. For example, Johnson & Johnson are the manufacturers of Nicorette, and they run one of the biggest health charities in the world. And they've been donating millions of dollars to organizations such as the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the American Cancer Society. In particular, they've been giving money to the American Lung Association, and they're one of the biggest donors to the American Lung Association. So what does the ALA say about vaping? Well, it tweeted out, switching to vaping is not quitting smoking. And on the website, they say, vaping is smoking. These statements are blatant lies. It's like saying war is peace or freedom is slavery. And the only reason that the American Lung Association can be saying these things is because of where they're getting their funding from. Another person who lies about vaping is Professor Stanton Glantz. I met him a couple of years ago when he was in Ottawa. So amongst other things, he falsely claims that vaping increases your risk of having a heart attack. But in this study, he included vapers who had a heart attack before they started vaping. Clearly that wasn't caused by vaping. When this error was pointed out to him, he stood by his article, but eventually the journal retracted it. Nevertheless, this article is still quoted by anti-vaping activists. I saw him because he was at the Ottawa Model for Smoking Cessation, which is an organization which is funded by and partners with Pfizer, who make Champix. And at this event, he was treated like a rock star, and he was invited to give the keynote speech. The World Health Organization in January 2020 produced a report, E-cigarettes, how risky are they? And this was full of lies and misinformation. It was almost immediately called out by vaping experts around the world. For example, in England, it was said to be inaccurate. Peter Hayek said practically all the factual statements in it are untrue. John Britton said the WHO misrepresents the scientific data. It was called pure nonsense and ridiculous. In India, the WHO was accused of spreading misinformation. And from New Zealand, they said the WHO organization cannot be trusted to follow the science or do what is right. In Canada, Amelia Howard said, the document is recklessly dishonest, dangerously misleading to the public, and difficult to see as anything other than prohibitionist propaganda. So why would the WHO do this? Why would they produce such a biased and unfair report which damages their reputation? Well, you have to look again at the money, and you notice that the WHO Tobacco Control Program is heavily funded by the Bloomberg Initiative. So Bloomberg is a billionaire busybody who has no background in healthcare, but nevertheless he's donated literally $1 billion to the WHO, and therefore he seems to have control over their tobacco policy. And unfortunately, he incorrectly believes that nicotine will decrease your intelligence, and he thinks that vaping ought to be banned completely. The CDC has also acted badly on the vaping file. So in 2019, people around the world were vaping successfully without any major health issues, except in the United States, where a few young men were getting severe lung injury, which in some cases was fatal. The CDC was very quick to blame this on vaping and told people to stop vaping because it was dangerous. However, it was obvious that something strange was happening here, that these people couldn't be using legal store-bought normal nicotine vape because we've proven that that is relatively harmless. They must be exposing themselves to something new and toxic. And after 3 months, the CDC eventually agreed and said this was due to vitamin E acetate, which was contaminating not regular vape, but cannabis vape. But however, they've already labeled the disease as e-cigarette and vaping-associated lung injury. So now millions of people around the world think that e-cigarettes can cause fatal lung injury, and this includes many physicians. The way the CDC handled this, you have to think that they're either stupid, ignorant, or deliberately corrupt. Many physicians and medical organizations are beginning to sound like anti-vaxxers in the way that they respond to vaping. So for example, they tell big lies. They talk about vaping as a cause of popcorn lung. This is a really nice story and the media loves it, but the fact of the matter is there isn't a single vapor anywhere in the world who has got popcorn lung from vaping. They talk about vaping as a gateway to smoking, but we know that it's actually the reverse. It's an off-ramp from smoking. Both the anti-vaxxers and the anti-vapers stress rare risks. For example, they talk about exploding vapes. And it's true that there is a lithium battery in vape, and that could explode. It has happened from time to time. But the risk is very rare, and the risk from smoking in bed is very much higher. They also talk about the cancer risk from vaping, and there is a very small cancer risk from vaping, but it's about 1% of the risk from cigarette smoking. And both groups lie about the contents of the product. So for example, they talk about heavy metal poisoning from vaping, but the blood level of heavy metals in vapors is the same as in non-vapors. They also say that vape liquid contains antifreeze, but they're deliberately confusing propylene glycol, the safe antifreeze which is used in hot tubs and our recreational vehicles, which is present in vape, with the dangerous antifreeze, ethylene glycol, which makes you go blind and kill you, and that's not used in vape juice. Finally, they say we don't know the long-term risk, and this is true. We never know the long-term risk of any medical intervention when we start it. If I was to invent a new surgical operation or a new heart pill, no one would expect me to wait 10 years so that I can report on the long-term outcome of my operation or my medication. At the moment, we don't know the long-term health effects of the COVID lockdowns or of the treatments that we're using for COVID patients. We believe that the vaccines are safe, but we don't have a 10-year study to prove that. But when millions of people around the world are dying, we have to act urgently, and we have to do what we think is best based on the available science. And we know that getting people to switch from smoking to vaping is something that will save lives. And in fact, there is no tobacco endgame without vaping. Because we've had nicotine patches for 36 years, we've had varenicline and bupropion for 23 years. And despite this decades of conventional treatment, we still have 4.6 million Canadians, 15% of the population, who still smoke. And many of these are in disadvantaged communities. They're indigenous, they're racialized, they have long-term health issues, particularly mental health issues, drug addiction problems. And these people are very hard to reach with conventional treatment. And in fact, they have been left behind and neglected. So when we talk about a tobacco endgame, it's commonly thought that we should be getting to a 5% prevalence of tobacco use by 2035. And that's a government target. But we're not going to get there if we just use the conventional methods that we have already. So even if we use plain packaging, if we increase taxes, if we make cigarettes less available, we do all these things, we're still going to fall 4% short of the goal of 5% smoking by 2035. We need vape shops. Vape shops are approachable and convenient. They're on the high street and you don't need to book an appointment. Vape shop owners look, act and speak like smokers because most of them were. They're not acting like professionals who wear white coats, don't smoke and don't have any friends who smoke. Smokers don't consider themselves sick, so they don't see that they should have to visit a doctor to get advice on how to quit smoking. Vaping is actually cheaper than nicotine replacement therapy or than smoking. And vape shops act as independent businesses. They don't need government funding. So this makes them ideal for third world countries that don't have the infrastructure or the physicians to run medical smoking cessation programs. However, we do need to train vape shop owners a little better. Most vape shop owners have personal experience in quitting smoking, and they've helped a lot of people to quit. But they may not know some of the underlying science. They may not know about the psychology of addiction or the pharmacology of nicotine. And unfortunately, there's little evidence about the roles that vape shops can play in smoking cessation. But they should be important at getting people to stop smoking, at avoiding dual use of tobacco and vape, and preventing relapse. And in France, they actually do have a vape shop certification program, which is run by Jacques Lehuzac. And so when vape shop staff have taken a course, they get a certificate that they can put up in their window so that they can explain to passers-by that they are certified in smoking cessation. We also need vape that's made to medical standards. Then they can be prescribed by physicians, sold in pharmacies, and covered by OHIP and other provincial and private drug plans. Then they could be used in medical smoking cessation clinics for patients who failed to quit with traditional nicotine replacement therapy. As a result, there would be two different ways that people could use vaping to quit smoking. They could either be independent and go through the vape shop route, or they could work with physicians and go through a medical route. Because without vaping, there is no endgame for tobacco. Current anti-smoking actions have had minimal effects at getting disadvantaged people to quit in developed countries, and we seem powerless to prevent the growth of the tobacco industry and its expansion into newly prosperous countries. Without vaping, we can expect another 100 years of profits for the tobacco industry as millions of people die each year. So in summary, tobacco-induced disease kills twice as many people as COVID and deserves a similar urgent and global response. Vaping is a safer alternative to smoking, and it can be used to help people quit. Teens who vape are less likely to take up smoking, so we shouldn't worry too much about teen vaping. Traditional tobacco control measures have left 20% of the global population still smoking. And if we want to reach an end game like 5% by 2035, we need to add vaping to our anti-smoking measures. This means both supporting vape shops and offering vaping as an alternative in medical smoking cessation clinics. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions or if you want a copy of my slide deck, this is my email address. These are some of the things that I've written about smoking cessation and about vaping. And I have a couple of other YouTube videos, one about the American Lung Association and one about the WHO that you can check out.